Okay, so welcome to our webinar today, and thank you for everyone who's coming around the world to this webinar on a very timely topic, the energy and the future of energy. Welcome to everyone from all over the world. I know that we have people from Fiji, we have people from the continent of Africa, we have people from North America, Europe, Asia, you name it. Welcome to everyone. And unfortunately, we do not have the translation into Finnish, the simultaneous translation due to some technical difficulties, and they always hit when you the least expect it, as usual. But we will actually then post this webinar later on with the translation, with the Finnish track. So you're going to have to just wait for a couple of days. But further ado, my name is Jani Salokangas, and I'm the director of the Finnish ICEJ. And this webinar is also made in conjunction with the partnership of FITA, which is the Finnish-Israeli Trade Association, where I'm actually sitting in the board of this association. So together with ICEJ and FITA, we're bringing you today Dr.Elai Rettig. He's a lecturer and assistant professor in the university, Department of Political Studies in Bar-Ilan University. He specializes in energy policy, national security, and international environmental politics. Prior to his PhD from the University of Haifa in 2019, he served as the visiting scholar at the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies in George Washington University. He has a very long list of accomplishments. We are not going to read them all, or we're going to be reading here for 2 hours, all the accomplishments of Dr. Elai Rettig. But further ado, welcome to this webinar, Dr. Elai Rettig, straight from Israel.
Thank you, Yanni. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the ICEJ to organize this. You told me about all the wonderful things that you do in Israel for Holocaust survivors, for refugees, and I'm glad to contribute in any way I can.
Yes, and also welcome to all the FITA members and all the friends from FITA. I know that we have plenty of them over here. But further ado, let's start to talk about the very interesting topic that we have today at hand, which is the energy and the future of energy. We are living in very interesting days where energy has become a bit of a hot potato, especially here in Europe, and where we have very high cost risings, and everyone is really feeling it in their skins when it comes to the energy prices. Could you start, Dr. Elai Rettig, educating us and the audience a bit on the macro level of the understanding of the energy sector and the fossil fuel industry? How does it run? How is it affecting our daily living? And how does it translate to Middle East economics and politics?
Great. Yes, thank you, Yanni. So there are a lot of misperceptions and good intentions when it comes to our discourse around energy and around how the energy markets work. We all understand that energy is important, definitely after this past few months when we see the prices rise, but there's a lot of misperceptions regarding where we are right now in terms of how the energy market works and when will be the kind of the transition away from fossil fuels. The hard reality is that we're very far away. We are dependent and addicted to fossil fuels. We run on oil, gas, and coal to create our modern society. In the media, it seems like we're about to move away. We're about to move to renewables. We're about to transition away, but we're very far from that. Today, 82% of the energy that we consume around the world is fossil fuels, especially oil, but also gas and coal. The rest is 5% nuclear, 10% biofuel and waste, which is a nice way of saying burning wood, like you do a lot in Finland, and animal dung in third world countries to heat their home. And that's our energy consumption. Everything that you read in the news, solar, wind, geothermal, all of that is about 3% of our global energy consumption. So it's just a drop in the water, and we're very far away from stopping our addiction to fossil fuels. And this might be surprising because when you read the papers, it really looks like we're about to move to 100% renewables. If it's just a politics change or, keep it in the ground. But there are three kind of problems in the way we talk about the energy markets that creates these misperceptions. So the first is that our discourse is very Western centric. We talk about ourselves. So we talk about the US, we talk about West Europe, and there are major advancements towards renewables in those countries. But most of the energy consumed around the world today is not in the West. It used to be in the 70s, but today it's only a third. All of the OECD developed countries together are just a third of the energy consumption. China and India alone are more than a third, more than the OECD. So if we want to understand, and they're very coal intensive and very oil intensive. So if we want to understand where our fossil market is, we have to look at the rest of the world too. So that's the first problem, is that we're very Western centric. The second problem is that we keep conflating energy with electricity. In the papers, we talk about how we're transitioning away, energy transition, when we really just are talking about electricity. Now that's important, but electricity is just 25% of why we use energy. Okay, nuclear, solar, wind, etc., all they know how to do is generate electricity. But electricity is just 25%. So even if we move 100% to renewables, there's still a big pie that we need fossil fuels for, and especially oil. And the third misperception is that oil isn't used for electricity. We barely use any oil for electricity. Just 3% of the electricity worldwide is from oil. So only countries in the Gulf and the Arab Gulf region and small island states still use oil to generate electricity. It's just 3%. So that means that even if we move completely to renewable energy, that doesn't affect oil at all. We are still addicted to oil. Oil is the main fossil fuel that we use, and it is not for electricity. Nuclear doesn't touch it, wind doesn't touch it, solar doesn't touch it. So the question is, so why? Why are we so addicted to oil if it's not for electricity? And we say, okay, so like cars, right? That's where we meet gasoline, oil, distillates in our everyday lives. And so if we just move to electric vehicles, right? If we all buy Teslas, then we won't need oil anymore, and we won't need the countries that oil comes from, which is mostly, right, 40% of it comes from the Middle East, from the Gulf region especially. But that is another misperception, because personal cars are not the main driver for oil demand around the world. If today we decide we have this global law that says we're not going to sell any more gasoline-powered cars around the world, we're only going to sell electric vehicles from now on, and let's say that by 2040, we did it. There are only electric vehicles on the planet that are being used alone, no gasoline-powered private cars. We will reduce the consumption of oil by 5% of what it is today in 2040, which is great, but it's not enough, right? We're still addicted to it. So it's important to understand that private cars are not the main driver for oil. Oil is in everything. Everything we have around us has oil in it. Whether oil is in the product itself, whether it's in the plastic or the rubber, whether it's the computer that I'm now talking through, whether it's the soles of my shoes or the buttons or the nylon in my shirt is made from oil, or the glasses on your face, or the makeup, the mascara on your eyes, or the pills that you consume, they all contain oil. But the concrete in the wall in front of me, the suit, the binding material of the concrete has oil in it. Toothpaste, cleaning material, shower curtains, they all have oil in the product itself. Even if oil is not an ingredient in the product, then anything you've ever encountered, everything you've ever purchased, every food that you've ever eaten, unless it's a carrot that you grew in your backyard. And even then, if you use non-organic fertilizer, then that's either oil or natural gas made it, right? Everything you've ever eaten was brought to you by a plane and a train and a truck and a ship. And sometimes all of these things combined from the moment they were taken out of the ground or mined or produced or packaged or manufactured to the moment they got to you. And that all involved oil. And currently, we don't have a good replacement, a good economic replacement for many of these functions that I just described. So we are going to be dependent on oil for the time being. Now, the reason I say this is not to discourage, right? I say this for three reasons. One is it's going to be very hard to stop our addiction to cheap and reliable oil. We need to stop it. Eventually it will happen whether we want to or not, because it's a finite resource and will end, but we don't know when. But it's important to understand that in order to meet a challenge, we need to fully understand the challenge and not sugarcoat it. And it's going to be hard because we need oil for our modern economy because it's in everything. The second reason I'm saying this is if oil is in everything, then when oil becomes expensive for a long time, everything becomes expensive. If a barrel of oil costs over $100 for a while, then everything becomes expensive in it because oil is in everything. It's in the packaging, it's in the product, it's in the shipping, it's in the product itself. And so that leads to the third point where if oil is expensive, then everything is expensive. Then if something happens in a major oil exporting country, and because of that, whether it's a civil war or instability or revolution, etc., or attack by another country, and because of that, they're not able to ship their oil outside, then it becomes everyone's problem. And it doesn't matter if you're buying oil from that country or not, if you're buying directly oil from that. It doesn't matter if the USA buys oil from Saudi Arabia or not. If something happens to Saudi Arabia and they're not able to ship 7 million barrels of oil per day, then the prices go up for everybody, because that means China can't get oil from Saudi Arabia. That means that the products, the plastics, the concrete, the glass that China creates becomes more expensive, and it makes it expensive for everyone. And so securing these countries, making sure that the countries that have a lot of oil and sell it is a major national security agenda of the international community. Now, because of these three things, because oil is in everything and it's very hard to stop, and because if oil is expensive and everything is expensive, because of that, we can't allow oil to not get out to the market, then that means that our leaders, whether in the West or in the East, whether it's Obama or Trump, whether it's the European Union or China or India, we will make a lot of efforts to secure reliable and cheap oil. And if there's someone who is willing, whether it's a dictator or not, we will look the other way for any abuse of human rights. We will ignore that, and we will make sure that that dictator is stable so that he will or she will export oil to us. And we are willing to swallow a lot of frogs if that leader is willing to promise us, specifically our country, uninterrupted and cheap, reliable supply of oil because our economy depends on it. And so far, I just talked about the economy. Keep in mind that the military doesn't work without oil. It doesn't matter how many battleships you have. It doesn't matter how many tanks you have, how many jet fighters you have. If during the war, someone cuts off your oil supply, then you don't have a military, right? As Putin discovered when he sent a convoy of tanks into Ukraine, and the Ukrainians bombed the two oil supply trucks. So you're just stuck. It doesn't matter. Oil is an enabler of national security and of national economy. And so we expect our leader to do everything in his or her capacity to make sure that we will receive reliable and cheap oil. And into that comes the Middle East, because the Middle East, especially the Gulf region, right? Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iran have the cheapest oil in the world. Saudi Arabia, especially, and the UAE have the cheapest, best grade of oil that's easiest to refine, that's cheapest to obtain. So if we can get that country to promise us to supply us with cheap and reliable oil, especially during a crisis, especially during a war, especially when everyone's trying to cut off our oil supply, and they are committed to selling us the oil, then we will do a lot to make sure that they remain our friends. And so a lot of the Middle East security apparatus, a lot of the reason why the US is so involved in the Middle East, a lot of the reason why the US wants to leave the Middle East but can't, it keeps finding itself back in the Middle East, right? It can leave the Middle East, but the Middle East won't leave the US, is because of this basic fact, because the US needs to make sure that oil from the Middle East continues to flow, even if it directly doesn't use that oil. You know, that's another kind of myth that we have, that the USA is dependent on Middle East oil. It is not. It hasn't been for decades. It buys oil from Saudi Arabia, but just because Saudi Arabia sells it really, really cheap in a discount to the USA. The USA can live off of oil from its own oil, plus Canada, plus Mexico and Nigeria. It doesn't need Middle East oil, but US allies need Middle East oil. Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, they need Saudi oil. If they don't get Saudi oil, they'll get it from somewhere else and the price goes up for everyone. So the US is kind of the guarantor of oil, and for that it needs a stable Middle East, and it needs to remain there and make sure that everything is stable. That's kind of a very macro view of things.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very eye-opening for many people how it's the energy sector is it's a chain that actually everything affects everything. And I know that people want to hear about the Ukrainian war, how has that affected the energy sector in Europe, in North America. But I will ask you actually a question that how has the Chinese and the Asian market, what is the role of the hungry Chinese energy market, and how does that change now lately? And does that reflect into geopolitical challenges in the region in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East?
Definitely. So China is the biggest consumer of Middle East oil. 90% of the oil coming out of the Gulf region goes to the Far East and mostly to China. China is the biggest coal consumer in the world. China burns more coal than the rest of the world combined, and it is the biggest oil consumer right now. It's a giant in terms of, so when oil prices go up, coal prices go up, it is directly affected. And that means that slowly it wants a stronger role within the Middle East. It wants to secure its pathways and the fact that someone will always sell it oil, and it's willing to break sanctions. It's willing to buy discounted Russian oil during the war. It's willing to buy discounted Iranian oil despite US sanctions, because it is very hungry for oil. It needs to satisfy 400 million Chinese who are middle class and upwards, and of course, all the rest. And it needs to, now it's not enough just to secure someone in Iran or to secure someone in Qatar that will sell you the oil. That's one thing. It's to secure a dictator or whoever to sell you that oil. But you also need to secure the security of the pathway from the oil that will actually get to you. Because someone can promise you oil, but then it will be cut off in the middle. And especially for China, that is a problem, because right now, when you have these major bottlenecks around the world, the Straits of Hormuz, right, maritime straits that are easy to block, the Bab el-Mandeb and the Straits of Malacca, when there's a blockage, where in a country like Iran or pirates threaten to block a maritime choke point, then the country that comes to help and open up the straits is the US Navy. The US has a deep sea Navy, and it is the guardian of the sea. It took the role of the hegemon, etc. That's great for US allies. That's great for Japan and South Korea. That's great for Europe. That's not great for China, because in a future scenario, which seems a little closer than maybe a year ago, if China goes into a major conflict, it will be against the US. Now, China gets most of its oil from the Gulf, and most of it goes through the Straits of Malacca. If something happens in the Straits of Malacca, it's the US Navy that comes there. So if suddenly China goes into war with the US, the first thing that the US Navy is going to do is block the Straits of Malacca. And then China doesn't have any oil, and the war ended that moment. So China, in order to prepare, in order to get to a point where it can even contend with the US on a violent level, not on just an economic level, it needs to develop its own deep sea Navy, and it needs to secure its own maritime pathways and buy ports all along the way to make sure that if something happens in the Straits of Malacca, it can send its own Navy to protect and secure that area, because it needs the Gulf oil more than the US. So that means that the Chinese need to build a deep sea Navy. They don't know how to deal, they didn't know how to build it. Very few countries have deep sea navies. It's very, very expensive. Israel doesn't have a deep sea Navy. The US has, France has, and so China needs to learn how to operate a deep sea Navy from someone, and the only one willing to do it is Russia. So it has to have a good relationship with Russia to learn how to do these things and secure its waterways. We tend to think about China as this very big, huge country, but most of the Chinese, right, they live on the East Coast, and it's very, very easy to block them. Historically, if you block the seas leading to China, to Shanghai and Beijing, you cut them off. That's what empires used to do. That's what Japan used to do. So China, because it's so oil hungry, it needs to make sure that it controls the water pathways, and it needs to make sure that it's getting its oil not just from the sea, but also from land, right? And its supplies. So the US can't cut it off during a war. So you have the whole Belt and Road Initiative. So a lot of the things that we're seeing today, a lot of the politics around the world, the conflict between the US and China over South China Sea, etc., a lot of it has to do with natural resources and the fact that fossil fuels still run our global politics. So we need to be aware of that.
Fascinating, actually. Now, going to the Ukrainian war and the whole conflict, what's going on right now at the moment, how do you think that the Ukrainian war has changed and affected the energy sector in Europe and the Middle East?
So it's changing it in a number of interesting ways. You know, there's the short term and the long term, because in the short term, when you have a crisis like what happened and energy prices are going up, gas prices and oil prices are going up, then on the short term, we need more oil and we need more gas. And right, if we have a situation where we're not buying oil from Russia, then since we don't have anything that does what oil does, we still need that Russian oil to be around. And so what Europe is doing is they're saying Russia is allowed to sell oil, but not to us. But go ahead and sell oil because we need oil. We can't replace it. So the Russians are selling it to China and India at a deep discount. And that's taking away market share from the Gulf, who they are supposed to be the major exporters of oil to those countries. So the Gulf, instead of selling it east, they're now selling it west to Europe to compensate for non-Russian oil. And Russia, instead of selling it west, they're selling it east. So the oil movement is changing. A lot of it is going through the East Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, making it a target for Iranian sabotage. A lot of oil tankers are now going through the Bab el-Mandeb much more than before. But that's the short term. So the short term means oil prices, gas prices are going up, and it's making the Middle East even more important, right? You see Biden knocking on the door of Mohammed bin Salman because he realized the truth of fossil fuels, where you need these countries on your side and you can't criticize them too much and you can't critique their human rights abuse, because when there's a crisis, you need to knock on their doors and ask them to export more oil, and you can't really be dismayed when they don't do it, right? Like OPEC now announced that they're actually cutting oil production. But this is the short term. The long term is that Europe needs to find a solution to depoliticize Russian gas. And this is another misperception that we tend to have in the media, where we keep talking about how Europe needs to stop using Russian gas. That's not the goal of Europe. The goal of Europe is not to stop Russian gas. And every time you see in the media, you see who are the most vulnerable countries to Russian gas, you keep seeing percentages. This country is 50% dependent on Russian gas. This country is 70% dependent on Russian gas, as if that is the only measure for energy security. But that's just one, right? One example is Finland. Finland, until very recently, was almost 100% dependent on Russian gas, but gas was only 5% of its total energy consumption. So Finland doesn't need gas that much. So yes, it's dependent on Russian gas, but it's not vulnerable to Russian gas disruption, because if Russia disrupts the gas, Finland has other means. And that's what Europe needs to do. It doesn't need to stop using Russian gas, because Russian gas is the cheapest available. And one day Putin won't be there and the infrastructure is already there and Europe will want that gas. But they need to find enough alternatives so that they can get the gas from somewhere else. They can get other types of power plants, renewable energy, etc. So they won't be vulnerable to Russian gas disruption. That way they can still buy cheap Russian gas, but when needed, they can stave off, they can survive 6 months, even a year without Russian gas until the politics sort themselves out. The problem with that is currently private market doesn't like energy security. And for the past 20 years, the European Union has privatized and liberalized the energy market because it made economic sense. But the private market doesn't build infrastructure just in case. It doesn't build a pipeline to Israel or build a new pipeline to Azerbaijan just in case one day Russian gas will be disrupted, so you will have leverage and you can take it from somewhere else. If a private company builds a pipeline, they want you to use that pipeline right now. So the private market doesn't know how to do these kind of things. And because of that, for 20 years, the private market just did the cheapest thing possible, which is to buy Russian gas and not build any redundancy and alternatives to when that's disrupted. The only way Europe can actually depoliticize Russian gas and fight that weapon is by taking over a little and starting to fund infrastructure projects, alternative energy projects, whether it's nuclear, whether it's more LNG intake facilities, whether it's renewable energy that can supplement gas when needed during disruptions, or provide economic guarantors to private markets. Until they do that, we're still a long way to go. And until then, we are very dependent on Middle East oil and gas. But the last thing I will say is that, again, this is just short term. When we have crises like this, in the short term, energy prices go up, but in the long term, we invest in alternatives. Because so long as oil and gas is cheap, there's no reason for countries that don't care about climate change, they're just thinking economically, there's no reason for them to invest in renewable energy, in nuclear, in alternatives. But when oil and gas prices are really, really high, suddenly we're talking about third generation nuclear power plants now. Suddenly we're talking about small modular reactors. We're talking about wind and solar again in countries that so far haven't talked about it because it makes economic sense for them. So yes, in the short term, this type of crisis leads to more fossil fuel consumption, but in the long term, it leads to more investment in alternative technologies. But we will only see that in 5, 7, 10 years from now. How this current crisis has actually leaped us forward in terms of alternative renewable energy technologies.
An interesting take also on the European soil is that since the turn of the century, the production of natural gas in the European Union has actually significantly declined. That also has to do with the fact that Europe made decisions in the energy sector to try to rely more on the Russian gas industry. And the interesting facts is that in 2000, approximately 243 billion cubic meters were produced in the European Union, but the figure to 2019 has fallen all the way down to 6.1 billion cubic meters. Why Europe is producing less gas, we know now afterwards many of the reasons, but do you think that this will increase drastically? And do you think that the gas prices at the moment, which has a strong impact also on the fertilizing industry, which then influences directly a whole food production industry, what do you think that this is going to be the impact, especially looking at the third world countries?
So that's a great question. So when energy prices go up, then we see technological innovation. Technological innovation can mean more renewables, but it can also mean new technologies to get more oil and gas out of the ground, right? Fracking became an economic technology because oil prices were so high in 2008. So it made sense to put money into fracturing, into this new technology. And Europe is undergoing the same thing. So Europe has a lot of potential for much more oil and gas domestic production than it currently has. It used to produce a lot of gas, especially the Netherlands was a major producer of natural gas, but that gas slowly declined, the field slowly declined, and they tried to introduce this new technology coming from the US, which is fracking. Fracking has a lot of potential in Europe, right? This idea of fracking is that you drill not just down, but also horizontally through these rock structures that are very porous. We always knew that they were there. For 70 years, we know that there's shale formations that have a lot of oil and gas all over the US and Europe, but it costs a lot to drill them. And when oil prices are $60, then it doesn't make any economic sense to actually look and develop this technology. But in 2007, 8, oil prices were almost $140 for a few days per barrel. And it made a lot of sense to invest in it. So we found a way to drill horizontally and then shoot those rocks with strong water and currents, along with sand and some chemicals to fracture them. And then the oil and gas from the pores of the rock goes into it and up. This technological revolution made the US from the biggest importer of oil to now having oil for the next 120 years. And it's now an exporter of oil and gas. Europe has a lot of potential in fracking as well. France has a lot of potential. West Europe and even Romania, there's a lot of fracking potential. Right now, in most of these countries, it's banned. It's banned for reasonable reasons. So the Netherlands were the first to try to implement fracking in a major way to get more gas out of the ground. But there are a few problems with fracking. One is that the chemicals seep into water reservoirs, our drinking water, our aquifers. And that's a problem. Now, today, that used to be a problem. Today, to be fair, the technology is safe enough that it almost doesn't happen where it pollutes the water. Having said that, there's a second problem, which is way bigger, is that fracking causes earthquakes. If you drill on fault lines, it causes earthquakes. And in the Netherlands, because they started experimenting with fracking, There were a lot of earthquakes, and a lot of buildings in the north, Groningen, became really damaged, and they had to stop. And so gas production declined significantly in the past 10 years in the Netherlands because fracking just doesn't work for them because of the fault lines. And so Europe suddenly didn't have its major domestic supplier of gas and had to buy more from Russia. But West Europe still has a lot of potential for fracking. Right now, they don't want to do it for environmental reasons, for earthquakes. If oil and gas prices remain high for a while, then you'll suddenly see them talking about this as well. At the end, especially gas fracking, because at the end of the day, people are willing to forgo some of their ideology for, they want the electricity to go up, and they want to be warm in the winter. And so there will be more and more pressure to resume fracking in Europe and make it into a more of a domestic producer of gas, not just a consumer.
Do you see this, tighter environmental policies, and now, for example, the lower production of gas in Europe? Do you see that it's going to have a compounded negative effect on poorer countries, especially when it comes to agriculture, because of the fertilizing industry skyrocketing prices?
Yes, fertilizer is made, or non-organic fertilizer, which is the vast majority of the fertilizer we use around the world, is made out of natural gas, and mainly natural gas and oil. If those prices go up, then fertilizer goes up, then eventually the price of food goes up. When that happens, then countries start to prioritize. And if fertilizer is expensive, they first use it for their own good, and then export it, in a profit to third world countries. So they get hit. So yes, and when energy prices go high, then everything goes high. And the first to get hit by it are the poor countries that are dependent on imports of food, that are dependent on imports of fertilizers. So yes, in the short term, it will hurt food security, not just energy security, not just lights and heating, but it has global repercussions that we can't even pinpoint.
There's a question here that came to the chat. It says, I have a feeling that the EU and the US have sanctioned Russia, who is now benefiting from this much more than we are hurting, as we embrace for hopeful, not such a good and very cold winter, actually.
I agree. When Russia started its campaign, its invasion of Ukraine, Europe was very kind of excited over this idea of sanctioning Russia, punishing it, not buying oil from it, etc. But all that did was raise the price of oil. And, in the month of June, Russia made more profit from oil exports than it did in the 4 years before that. So on the short term, all of these sanctions did, or these threats of sanctions, most of these sanctions on oil didn't actually happen, but just the threats caused the prices to rise. And even though Russia is selling that oil at a discount to India and China, they're still making a huge profit from oil, and oil is the main vector of their economy. More than twice the profits that they're getting from gas, they're getting from oil. And even gas, they're still selling to Europe, even during this war. So yes, it's hard. We need oil. We don't have anything to replace oil, but we can get oil from other places. It takes time, but oil exporters make a profit out of it in the meantime. Gas is a whole different game. Gas is dependent on very, very expensive physical infrastructure, either a pipeline or you need to build an LNG facility. So you can't just switch a supplier. You need to build infrastructure to a new supplier to get it to you. So the fact that Europe has, with open eyes, became more and more dependent on Russian oil and gas without creating sufficient alternatives in case of a disruption, even though Russia continued to give clues that it will use this as a weapon, is something that Europe needs to contend with. I would say especially one country, Germany, but West Europe as a whole, because I think East Europe did, alert, Poland, etc., did alert from this, but that is something that they will need to contend with and take away some power from the private market and start to think about security as a premium, as something that you need to pay more for sometimes.
Now, moving from Europe to the land of Israel, what do you think about the energy sector of Israel? How does it look like at the moment? How does the future look like? And how do you see the current effects of the energy sector, which we're having huge troubles here in Europe and many other countries? Does Israel have the same issues and challenges?
So no, Israel is actually in a very good place right now. Israel found 10 years ago, it found big natural gas deposits, which it buys domestically in a fixed price, which means that we have a contract for 15 years on a fixed price. It doesn't matter what happens, the price of gas remains the same. So we have barely experienced this inflation. We experienced this inflation by importing, plastics, et cetera, that are more expensive. But if we're talking about double-digit inflation numbers in Europe, in Israel, it's less than 5% inflation. We're not experiencing it because we have domestic natural gas that we're consuming. We have so much of it that we have a different problem, is that we are trying to export half of it, right? So technically, we found 10 years ago, we found two major gas fields, Leviathan and Tamar, and also two small ones, Karish and Tanin, and they provide us with about 1,000 BCM. Now, that's a lot for us because we just consume 12 BCM every year. That will go up to 15 BCM, 16 BCM, as the population grows, et cetera. That's still enough gas for the next 70 years, 7-0. So the idea in Israel is we should at least sell 40% of that to also enjoy some of the profits. And if we start selling the gas, then maybe more companies will come in and look for more gas deposits. So we will enjoy both worlds. The problem with that is that there's a big gap between kind of what we want to do with the gas and what we can technically, physically do. Because so far, 10 years have passed, and we've only managed to close 2 export deals, and that's with Egypt and with Jordan, the 2 countries next to us that are in peace with us. We haven't managed to create a major export project to Europe or to the big markets that we can enjoy from. And the reason is economics and the politics just don't seem to work, right? So we have a number of options where Israel can export gas. One of them is to build a pipeline to Europe, to Greece, to Italy. That is a very ambitious pipeline. It's called the East Med pipeline. And if we build it, it's going to be the biggest, longest, deepest underwater pipeline in the world. The East Med is a very deep bathtub. So if we're talking about building this pipeline, Nord Stream 2 goes 50 meters underground. This East Med pipeline, if we build it, goes 2,000 meters underground. We've never built a pipeline this deep. It's space technology. We're not sure we even know how to do it. Because it's so deep, that means that there's water pressure, so the pipeline needs to be small. It can't be too wide in its diameter or will collapse. In Crete, in the island of Crete, the bottom of the sea is volcanic, so it moves. There's a bunch of engineering problems there, and that means that if we want to build this pipeline, it's going to have to be a high price that we ask for it to make economic sense. And this is where gas and oil differ from one another. If I find oil, then I'm great. I take the oil out of the ground, I put it in a tanker. Oil is shipped globally via sea. So I put it in a tanker and I look for someone to buy it, and someone will definitely buy it, even if they don't need it. If I give it in a discount, they will still buy that oil and put it in strategic reserves. Sometimes I don't even need to know who buys my oil. There's an Italian broker who buys Nigerian oil with a Qatari tanker to France. There's no direct connection. With gas, it doesn't work like that. Because gas is gas, it's not a liquid. I need to physically connect that wellhead all the way with a pipeline, even if it's in the bottom of the sea, to whoever is going to consume it. I need a direct physical connection. And until I don't have that connection, until I don't build the pipeline, I can't physically take the gas out of the ground. So I need to know in advance who's going to buy my gas, and I need them to commit to a 10 to 15-year binding contract on a fixed price, so I know I can recuperate the cost of a $7 billion pipeline. And so far, Europe talks a lot about how much it wants gas from the East Mediterranean, but no one in Europe, no private company is willing to sign a contract that says, when you finish building this pipeline in 5 years, I'm going to buy it at $8 per BTU for 10 years, no matter what happens to the price. 2 years ago, Europe was paying $2 per BTU. So definitely no one was willing to buy it for $8 per BTU, which is what we need in order to build this pipeline. But today it's $25 per BTU in Europe. But that's because of a crisis. If the crisis ends, then prices are going to drop again. Yesterday, prices went negative because there's so much LNG currently in Europe because of the panic to buy LNG. So a private investor in Europe is saying, yes, now it's $25, but in 5 years from now, it's still going to be $25. Is there still going to be a war in Ukraine? Is there still even going to be a Putin? There's going to be someone else there, and we're still going to buy the gas from there. So the prices are going to go down, and I don't want to commit to it. So Israel is kind of stuck. It doesn't have anyone in Europe that's willing to buy its gas right now. It has a lot of talk, but no one is actually willing to put the money. And so Israel needs to start thinking a little differently, which is not to be an gas exporting country, but to become a gas consuming region where most of its clients sits around it, and we start consuming that gas a lot. But that conflicts with another major goal that Israel has, and that is our desire to advance solar energy and renewables in addition to gas. If we don't have anyone to sell the gas to, then we will use more gas, and that will dissuade us from actually investing in solar energy, although we have huge potential in that.
So going just a little bit more into the gas fields that Israel found. Now today, actually, Israel and Lebanon come with a deal, a historical maritime deal on their sea borders. That was a long-standing dispute. Do you see this influence or affecting the gas industry even between Israel and Lebanon, or Israel and its neighbors? Is Israel able to, for example, sell now its gas to even Lebanon or Egypt or other countries?
So this is a good deal, the maritime agreement between Israel and Lebanon, because conflict is bad for business. And the more that Israel and the countries around it can show the world and show international energy companies that they know how to play with one another, and they know how to cooperate and put the domestic politics aside and cooperate over a big infrastructure project, or they know how to create agreements between them to drill for oil, then that is a good sign for international energy companies to come and look for more gas. Right now, with the current amount of gas that Israel has, it can't justify on its own a major energy infrastructure project, whether it's an LNG facility or a pipeline to Europe. But if we find more gas in the region, whether it's Lebanon finding it or Cyprus finding it or Egypt finding it, the more gas we find, the more it makes sense to build a major project, because the more gas can flow, and then it makes sense. So Israel has an interest to show the world that it can cooperate with the countries around it. In any case, you need to cooperate because you need to build a pipeline or LNG, and that goes through other countries' exclusive economic zones. Right now, we don't even know if there is any gas in that area, this disputed area between Lebanon and Israel. There might be a gas field there called Kana. How big it is, we have no idea, because Total, the French energy company, hasn't actually drilled there, more than just assessing that there might be gas there. So this deal might amount to nothing other than two enemy countries, where Lebanon technically doesn't recognize the existence of Israel, now for the first time actually signed a deal with Israel, recognizing one of the borders with it. And that's a major advancement. If Lebanon finds gas there, then that can be great for Lebanon's economy, and that's within Israel's interest. Israel has an interest that Lebanon, that Jordan, that Egypt will be financially stable, because if they're not, if they go into chaos, if the government collapses, whether the king falls in Jordan or the government collapses in Lebanon, that's bad news for Israel, because then militant organizations grow, run freely, run on the borders, and they hit Israel as well. So Israel has an interest in the stability of the countries around it, and economic benefits coming from mutual gas finds and cooperation is something that's a win-win situation. And I'm glad that both Israel and Lebanon managed to find a deal 5 kilometers over there, 5 kilometers over here. It doesn't matter in the long term. And that the long term is that this is a win-win situation.
Going a bit to the renewable energy sector in Israel, what is the roadmap in achieving some of its goals? What are the goals for the Israeli renewable energy sector? And what is the role of solar, wind? Is there any other means how to achieve those goals? And can you just tell where's this whole sector going to at the moment?
Yeah. So Israel has a huge potential when it comes to solar. The whole solar issue is really interesting in Israel because we've been trying to develop solar energy since the 50s. Basically, since we were established in 1948, we wanted to create solar energy and find solar energy technologies. And it wasn't about climate change. Nobody talked about climate change in the 50s. It wasn't about the environment. For Israel, it has always been about security. We always saw renewable energy, and especially solar, as a national security issue that will benefit us in terms of hard security. I'll explain. In Israel, security has always been the biggest motivator for innovation. Israel is a startup nation. We invent things that no one else has, and we do it really efficiently and cheap. And security has a big part in this. I'll give an anecdote that I really like to give, which is that Israel is the only country in the world that launches its satellites to the west. Every other country in the world, when they launch a satellite, they launch it east with the Earth's rotation, because the Earth's rotation makes the rocket faster. They help the velocity, and the satellite goes easier into the stratosphere. You probably noticed when you fly from Finland to Israel, it takes less time than when you fly from Israel to Finland, right? Because you're going against the Earth's rotation. So every country does that, except Israel. Israel can't afford to launch satellites to the east because that might fall into enemy territory. And then Israeli secret technology is within enemies, or they shoot it down. So we have to launch west. Now, in order to do that, we either need to make huge rockets that are much, much stronger with much more fuel set that they'll get over the Earth's rotation and through the stratosphere, or we build the satellites much, much, much more smaller and lighter. And so Israel, since the early 90s, became a leader of miniaturized satellite technologies. And not because we were smarter than everyone else, but because we were the only country that needed it. We're the only country that needed really small satellites. And because we found a way to make these satellites smaller and lighter, they were also much, much cheaper. And so now every SpaceX private company that's sliding or cellular company that's flying a satellite into space, they're using Israeli technology because it's small and cheap. And we're the first one that did it because we're the only one that needed it. And so we did it before everyone else, and we became a lead export it. Now, why am I saying this? Because it's the same deal with a lot of Israeli innovation, whether it's our agricultural innovation, irrigation technologies, the fact that we can grow food in arid climates, right? Because we were always afraid since our establishment that we will be embargoed by other countries and we'll run out of food. So we had to learn how to create our own food and be independent in that sense. But half of our country is a desert. So we had to find ways through irrigation, through genetically modified organisms to make apples, to make vegetables and fruits that can grow in the desert, that can grow in hotter climate and less water. Now, growing food in hotter climate and less water is a problem that everyone needs to contend with now, as we reckon with the problems of climate change. We've been doing it since the 50s because we got stuck in a security problem. Same thing with Iron Dome, same thing with water desalination, and the same thing with solar technology. So since the 50s, we've been trying to develop solar technology because at the beginning, all of electricity was from oil, and oil was really hard to get because all of the oil countries were boycotting us, right? The Arab oil embargo. So since the 50s, we've developed, an Israeli innovation was a solar water heater on the roof. And in the 70s, when oil prices went high, it became a law in Israel that everyone needs to put a solar water heater on the roof. And today, 90% of households in Israel have solar water panels on their rooftops because it was a law in Israel. It was subsidized, etc., because of security, because we wanted to take off the pressure from the electricity grid. So everybody had to warm their waters with panels, and we got used to it. We know, we shower in the evening when the water became hot from the sun. We changed our way of life, but it worked. So in the early 2000s, when we started developing photovoltaic panels that know not just how to heat water, but also generate electricity, it was really easy to sell this to Israelis because we already had panels on our roof. We already built our houses because it's a law since the 70s. So when we build a new house, we already have room for a solar panel in the house. It's part of the building code. So it's really easy to convince an Israeli to put a solar panel on the roof. And in the early 2000s, again, it was for security purposes because the idea was to become energy independent. And one thing that made it really, really clear was the Second Lebanon War in 2006. when Hezbollah started firing rockets at us and tried to target our power plants. And that's when we realized that the major benefit of a coal power plant, which is what we had, is actually its main weakness. Because the main benefit of coal power plant is that you can create a huge amount of electricity in one small place, much more than a solar field. You need huge amounts of land for solar panels. Coal can create thousands of megawatts in one small place. That's great, unless you're being attacked by rockets. And then it's a really, really bad idea to have all your electricity generated in just one place. And so Israeli policymakers realized it's actually good to have tens of thousands of small little power plants in the form of photovoltaic panels all over the country, so that even if they target us with rockets, we still have backups everywhere because of the solar panel, because of its decentralized nature. So we started putting solar panels on important buildings for security necessity, not climate change. It wasn't in our agenda. So if you go to Israeli parliament, the Knesset, there's solar panels on the roof. So if there's a major blackout, if there's a major war and there's no electricity in Israel, the Knesset, the parliament, still has electricity because it has the backup generators and the batteries and the solar panels. The Teddy Soccer Stadium in Jerusalem is a gathering point in case of a disaster. There's an earthquake in Jerusalem, then you need a gathering point. So the Teddy Soccer Stadium, the National Soccer Stadium of Israel, is where everyone will gather in case of an earthquake. They will lose their home and they need somewhere to sleep. So the entire stadium is lined with solar panels. So even if there's no electricity in Jerusalem, the Teddy Soccer Stadium will have electricity. And so that's where we go at. We want solar energy, not because of CO2 and not because of pollution. Israel is a really small player when it comes to CO2 emissions. We're 10 million people, but we're pretty efficient when it comes to energy consumption. The amount of CO2, man-made CO2 emissions that Israel emits is 0.2% of global man-made emissions. It's nothing. It's less than 6 months worth of SUV sales in the US alone is how much we pollute. So that's not the thing. For us, CO2 is not, we're not a major contributor to CO2. For us, it's security. We want at least 30% of our electricity coming from decentralized solar panels because it makes security sense for us. But this is a challenge. So we want by 2030 to reach 30%. Right now we're 2022 and we're only at 7% of solar energy in our electricity mix. We're very far from our goal. And the reason for that is because in 2010, we made this plan in 2000. In 2010, we found gas and suddenly our calculations changed. It's very hard to compete with domestic cheap gas when you suddenly have it. It's not, solar needs to compete not with imported oil and coal. Now it needs to compete with solar energy. So we have a challenge here because one of the major problems with solar energy is the amount of land it takes. And Israel has a lot of things. It doesn't have land. And the little land that we have, we're kind of at war with. And if we want to reach 30% just from solar, keep in mind, we don't have wind in Israel. We don't have strong, consistent wind. We don't have rivers. We don't have hydropower. We only have solar. And we want to get 30%. For that, we need 5 times the size of the city of Tel Aviv covered in solar panels to reach 30%. And the growth consumption in Israel, the population grows in Israel like a third world country. We make a lot of kids. So we consume more energy every year. And it's a major problem. So we want solar energy. It's not a political thing in Israel, but in order to get there, we need to find better technologies. We understand that we want solar, but we need to make it better because it takes up too much land right now. And we just can't afford to build 5 cities of Tel Aviv worth of solar panels. So we are very much in the forefront of making solar panels smaller and more efficient so they can take up less land and make more electricity from the same solar panel. That's where we're at. And that's where we're trying to lead and sell to the rest of the world. Now, I'm from Bar Ilan University, and we have a center there called NICE, which is a National Institute for Sustainable Energy. And we're trying to find solutions. And everywhere in Israel, we're trying to find it. So one issue is that solar panels take up land. They take up too much land. We don't have that land. So one way to do it is if we make the solar panels thin enough, then the sun can get through the solar panel. You can generate the electricity, but the sun still goes through it and you can still grow things under that solar panel. So it doesn't create shade. So you can take agriculture land and make it into solar fields and still grow things underneath, right? So agri-solar, that's one solution. And so you have dual use land. The other solution is we don't have land, but we have the sea. And the Mediterranean Sea is a rather calm sea, not a lot of storms or waves or tsunamis. So you can build the solar panels in the sea. But the major problem with that is corrosive, the salt. It ruins the solar panels really, really fast, and you need to replace them all the time. So we're working in Israel. The president of my university of Bar Ilan is a chemist, and he has even a patent on self-repairing solar cells that know how to repair themselves from corrosion, from salt. And that's another thing that we're working on. The third thing is batteries, storage. If we don't find useful, efficient and cheap ways of storing that electricity, these big batteries, then it's not going to work. I can offer you an iPhone and tell you, this smartphone is sustainable. It doesn't use cobalt. It doesn't use kids in the Congo, etc. It's great. And I'm going to sell it to you half price. So you say, of course, I want this sustainable half price phone. But then you say, wait, there's a catch. It only works a third of the day. And in 2/3 of the day, the smartphone doesn't work. And when there's an emergency or a storm, the smartphone just doesn't work all of a sudden. So you say, okay, so it's cheap, but that's not enough. I want my smartphone to work 24/7, right? And if it doesn't work 24/7, then you need to make it cheaper than half. Sell it to me at a third of the price. I will buy it. And in my other pocket, I will still keep my clunky phone that works 100% of the time in case there's an emergency. And this one only works a third of the time. And the same thing with solar and wind, etc. Until we find storage, then for every kilowatt of solar that we generate, we still need a kilowatt of natural gas or coal or oil to replace that and supplement that during the night when there's no electricity from solar. So we need to find batteries, and we need to have very, very big batteries. The problem with that is that it uses rare earth minerals, and it's very expensive, and it uses kids in the Congo, etc. And so we're looking for ways to use different materials that are not rare earth minerals to create these batteries. For instance, sodium, salt from the sea. That's one of the most common elements that we have, and we can use that instead of cobalt, which makes things much more cheap and much more available, and human rights and everything. And the last thing that I'll say is smart grids. If we want an efficient, renewable-based electricity market, then we need smart grids, grids that know how to get electricity from 10,000 places at once and knows how to move them without collapsing. Smart grid needs to be digital, and that means it's open for cyber attacks. That means that an invading force can take off your electricity in a second because it's digital. Luckily, Israel is the leader in cyber defense. So all of that is just to say that Israel has a lot of potential when it comes to solar, but not in its own market. The big potential for Israel, because we're not a big donor of CO2 emissions. The big potential for Israel is that we, by 2030, create these patents, make solar technology better, and then sell it to the real polluters, to China, to India, to the USA, to the European countries that emit a lot. And that's where we make the change. Because if it's just us emitting less CO2, then it doesn't matter if it's just us doing it. CO2 emissions, climate change, it's a global problem, and we need everybody on board. I can say that I'm reducing CO2 emissions, but if China isn't reducing CO2 emissions, then it doesn't even matter. And you have, the European Union saying, we're growing in terms of our economy, but we're emitting less CO2. So if we can do it, everyone can do it. But the reason Europe is saying that is because they're cheating. They're, in a sense, they're outsourcing their pollution. What they did is just moved all of the heavy industry, all of the polluting industry, the cement, the plastics, the textile, they moved it to East Asia, to China, to India, to Bangladesh. So they just outsourced the pollution. So rather than doing the pollution in Europe, they're doing the pollution in East Asia, and they're buying the finished product, which is even more polluting because they're doing it there where there's no, safety standards and etc. And they're paying for the shipment with oil to get to them. So Europe can say that it's emitting less CO2, but globally we're emitting more CO2 every year. So it doesn't work like that. It's cheating. You need to think globally, and Israel thinks globally. Israel says, my tiny market is meaningless, but if I can create the patents that will be implemented in the big markets, then me, small Israel, can make a huge change when it comes to climate change and reducing CO2 emissions. But we need to think globally, not just about ourselves.
That is very interesting that you said about the cheating aspect of literally just shifting production lines to third world countries where it's a lot cheaper, and then sort of saying that, well, we have reduced our emissions, but basically you're buying dirty steel or aluminium coming directly from China, which is growing all of its emissions in factor 10. But do you see any political opportunities for Israel, especially when it comes to selling this renewable energy patents around the world? Do you see any policy making initiatives and strategies playing on that side?
Definitely, it's not altruistic. It's not that Israel, of course, wants geopolitical and economic benefits from selling this technology. Same thing with water desalination, same things with the other technologies it has. And it has a lot of opportunity to do so. For example, with the Abraham Accords that it signed with the Gulf states. Now, you would think the Gulf states are so energy rich. What do we, Israel, have to offer them? When it comes to energy, but we actually have a lot to offer them because these oil-rich states really want renewable energy, and it makes economic sense for them. And they're not doing it for climate. Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman definitely doesn't do installing solar panels for the climate. He's doing it because it makes a lot of sense, because we're talking about the future of oil and how eventually we'll move away from oil, hydrogen, etc. It will happen in 30, 40, 50 years. But when it will happen, the prices of oil will go down, and you'll have oil industries in the US and Norway, etc., go out of business and $20 a barrel. But the Middle East has the cheapest oil in the world, $10 a barrel. Saudi Arabia still makes a profit from its oil. So the Middle East, the Gulf, will still produce oil for many, many decades from now. Even if we don't use oil for cars anymore because we found a new technology, we don't use it for airplanes anymore because we found a new technology, we're still going to need oil for plastics and rubber. We don't have anything to replace that. And so Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, will become plastic exporters and rubber exporters, etc. But in order to meet that vision where they're still the last man standing when it comes to oil exports, they need to make sure that they have a lot of oil to export. And the major problem that the Gulf states currently have is a population boom that are very, very wasteful in consumption. They waste, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, waste a lot of oil and gas on their own domestic population who enjoys free gas, free oil. They all buy SUVs. They turn on their air conditioning in the morning, go to work, come back, and the house is nice and cool because they don't pay for the electricity. And all of the electricity there is from oil and gas because that's a domestic source that they have. That means that instead of selling oil and gas outside and making a huge profit, Saudis, the Emiratis, etc., they're literally burning it on their own population for free. So their solution is, let's find another way of generating electricity so we can free up oil and gas to sell to the international community. So they're looking at solar energy. They're looking at nuclear. They're looking at energy efficient technologies to do the same thing, but with less energy. Luckily, we're experts in Israel on that. And ironically, we're experts because of them, because they boycotted us for so many years that we found ways to become much more energy efficient. Now we're selling them these technologies. So, the tables have turned. And so this is a major opportunity for us. We are enjoying the Abraham Accords, and we're selling them technologies which are not just, spy technologies and weapons, but actually things that are good for the environment and can kind of help them. But they're not doing it for environmental reasons. They're doing it because it makes sense economically. And that's important to understand that, if you're trying to sell renewables around the world, not everybody thinks the same way. Not everybody has the same interests. Not everybody cares about, what Greta Thunberg says. You need to sell them renewables in another way. For Israel, it's security. For the Gulf, it's about economics, right? Because they put a lot of money in solar, but for every kilowatt of solar, they're freeing up oil to sell. So they're making a profit. For China, it's about pollution reduction, not about CO2, because, there's some days in Beijing you can't breathe because of the coal. So it makes sense for them to clean up the air so that people won't, get lung disease and cancer, etc. Each country has its own motives and interests. And in order to find the global solution, we need to understand that each of these countries have their own interests and solutions. And we're trying to find kind of our our entryway, us Israel, to how to sell these technologies to each of these countries.
There is a question that came here, which says that, is Europe eating its political influence by shrinking its economical and economy through extreme environmental policies, and then in turn giving its power that they've gained throughout the decades through its bad policy making to China and other major players?
It's a tough question because, in the long term, the transition is good. It is necessary. Eventually, it will happen because fossil fuels are a finite source, and you'd rather be the one that develops these technologies and gets there first before someone else. It makes sense. The problem is that Europe, because of the securitization of climate change, because of the sense of urgency that the world was going to end in 12 years, etc., Europe kind of rushed into it with eyes closed to the point where it started to affect its energy security. It is good to promote renewables, but we need to first promote the technologies to make it better, the storage, to make it more reliable. It's not enough that it's cheap. It first needs to be reliable, and we need to make the technologies better before we move forward. And it needs to be depoliticized. That I don't know, for some reason, renewables have become a leftist issue and fossil fuels has become a right issue. And it's a technology. There's no reason to put an ideology around it. We want to move to a world that is renewables, but we need to make the technology better. And we need to understand that technology just isn't there yet. Right now, we can't move to 100% renewables. We just can't. Technologically, it is impossible until we make the technology much better. So Europe, I think what this energy crisis is doing is maybe making Europe kind of not stop, not go back, but kind of pace itself and understand that the transition to renewables has to go hand in hand with energy security. Because if you move too fast into renewables and jeopardize your energy security, and because of that, there's a blackout, because of that, Russia has advantage of you, you're creating enemies to renewables. Which is unjustifiable. Renewables is good, but so you need to strike a balance, and you can't go all in before you have the technologies to do it. So what Europe needs to do is put the money into renewables, into research and development, which is what the US is doing right now with the Inflation Reduction Act. Europe needs to be there as well to understand that the technology has limits. It's not about ideology, and how do you fix these limits?
Well, I think Europe is learning this the hard way at the moment.
Yeah.
And there's another question. Does the Israeli neighbors have any renewable energy plans? And can Israel play a role in it?
Jordan has plans. So I said that Israel doesn't have land for solar, but Jordan has a lot of land, and most of it is empty. And the solar radiation in the south of Jordan is very, very strong. So that means that if you put a panel in the south of Jordan, you can create more electricity from the same solar panel than if you put it in Israel, because the solar radiation is stronger in Jordan. So ideally, the Jordanians can build a lot of solar panels and then sell electricity back to Israel or to Syria or to Egypt, ideally. Right now there's a project to build 600 kilowatts worth of solar panels in Jordan, and that will be funded by Qatar either or the UAE. And Jordan will sell some of that to Israel. Israel, in return, will desalinate seawater and sell fresh water to Jordan. And that's a good deal, but it's not enough, 600 kilowatts. Israel, on a hot day, consumes 13,000 kilowatts. So it's just a drop in the water, but there is a lot of potential. Egypt has a lot of space. Egypt has a lot of empty land. Jordan has a lot of empty land. But again, it's not about, I keep hearing people say, oh, let's just build all of the solar panels in the Sahara Desert and then just, sell that electricity to the entire world. That doesn't work. Electricity doesn't like to travel long. You lose a lot of the electricity the longer it travels. So you need to have the solar panels next to where you're consuming it. Otherwise, you lose most of it, and then it's not economical anymore. And because solar panels only work a third of the day, then it doesn't make economic sense. So because you get the electricity when you don't need it, when everyone is at work in the middle of the day, you need the electricity the most. It spikes up at 6 p.m. when people go back from work to their houses and turn on their TVs and ACs. That's exactly when solar panels stop working. So until we find really good batteries, we're not going to move there. But once the technologies are there, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, those resource poor countries in North Africa and in the Middle East are going to move fast into renewables, and Israel will enjoy this as well. Having said that, when we're talking about sharing electricity, that's a big risk, because buying oil from another country, that's one thing. That country can be a complete failure, but so long as it's guarding its oil field, and there's a military there, and there's a Western company taking that oil and selling it to you, then you're fine. You don't care if that country is failing. But if you're buying electricity from that country, then you need to have a functioning country, and it needs to know how to operate its grid, etc. And the problem is Israel doesn't want to be too reliant on its neighbors to buy renewable electricity, because these countries aren't the most stable. They don't run their infrastructure that well, and it's hard to trust them with our electricity security. So it requires a very deep level of trust to share not just oil, but electricity, and to be dependent on another country's national electricity company. In Europe, you can do that sometimes. In the Middle East, with the level of trust that we have, which is very low, it's going to be a different ballgame to start sharing electricity grids with renewables.
And we are coming to the end. This was one more question, which is about Israel, and it says, why gas is not liquefied at the larger quantities? I think they're talking about Israel, and then sold to Europe.
So that's a great question. So I said one of the problems with gas is that you need a physical infrastructure, right? A pipeline. Now, technically, you can get over that if you liquefy that gas, right? If you make it really, really cold, you freeze it to the point where it becomes a liquid. Then you put it in a huge LNG tanker, which is a huge refrigerator, and get it to a regasification facility on the other end, and then they regasify the gas and sell it. That's a great idea. It quadruples the price of the gas. And it costs $5 billion just to build this LNG terminal. So when you build an LNG terminal, it's as if it's a floating pipeline. You don't build that terminal unless you know there's someone on the other end that's willing to buy that LNG, at least for the next 5 to 10 years on a fixed price. And then after they pay, after you finish paying for your LNG plant, you can start selling it to the rest of the world, like Qatar does, like Algeria, like Nigeria does. But at the beginning, you still need a binding contract with another country before you build an LNG facility. And currently, Israel doesn't have that. What we're doing is that we're using Egyptian LNG facilities. Egypt has 2 LNG facilities that are running on less than full capacity. We're selling that gas to Egypt. Egypt is liquefying it and selling it to Europe, but it's not enough. We're talking about 17 BCM that Egypt can liquefy. It's not going to save Europe from the 150 BCM that it's getting from Russia. So there's talking about a floating LNG, a ship that knows how to liquefy the gas on the ship, but that can only create 4 BCM, and it takes 3 years to build. An LNG terminal takes 3 years to build. So these are all options that Israel is looking into, but currently there's not someone to put the money into it. Right now it makes sense because there's a crisis, but in 3 years from now, will it still make sense to sell LNG to Europe? Yesterday, LNG in Europe was negative prices because there's too many LNG ships currently waiting on terminals in Europe that they had to sell their LNG at 0 price because there's no one to store it. So in this kind of volatile market, it's very hard to convince someone to put so much money into such an expensive project, which is a new LNG terminal, unless Europe is willing to pay for it, which is currently not willing to do.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there are not many LNG ships around, and I think one of them actually burned.
Yeah. So there are only 3 big FLNG ships, the ones that create LNG. And one of them burned. So you need to order a new one, and South Korea builds it, etc. It takes a few years to build an FLNG. Not an LNG tanker that just transports it, but one that can create the LNG. Yeah, you need to build one, and that takes years. So it's not going to solve Europe's problem in the next winter or even in the one after that.
Well, I think all of our listeners got a good macro level idea, and also with some very good insights from the Middle East, Europe, and also Asia. I think we are coming to the end. Thank you so much, Dr. Elai Rettig, straight from Israel. And I hope and I think that this won't be the last webinar, because I think this is a topic that will continue being very important, especially here in Europe and I think across the world. And we probably believe that Israel has some very good tools and abilities to also help in this area, many of the other nations. So thank you so much from my part, from the ICJ and FITA, and hope you all the best, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Yanni. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.